The glass doors were still open when Angel Hayes raised his voice. "Get out of my $5 million mansion," he said loud enough for every guest to hear. Laughter flickered, then silence. Hadley Whitmore didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply reached into her bag, pulled out a folded document, and tossed it onto the marble table between them. "Check the name," she said quietly. Angel smirked before unfolding it. He didn't smirk for long. "If you believe dignity doesn't need to shout to be powerful, stay with this story until the end. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Right now, I read every comment. And if stories about quiet strength and real justice matter to you, consider subscribing." Everyone who would later speak about Hadley Whitmore would agree on one thing. She was never the loudest person in the room. She didn't need to be. At 32, Hadley had built a career that depended not on volume, but on precision. She worked as a legal analyst at Carter and Wren, a mid-sized law firm in downtown Los Angeles known for handling complex real estate disputes, cases that often involved layered ownership structures, silent partners, and paper trails that were never meant to be followed all the way through. Hadley followed them anyway. She had a habit of writing things down. Not just the obvious details, dates, signatures, transaction amounts, but the smaller things most people overlooked. Pauses in conversations, inconsistencies in tone, the way a client avoided eye contact when discussing a particular clause. These details didn't belong in official records, but Hadley kept them in a series of slim black notebooks she carried everywhere. It wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. Her colleagues appreciated her for it, though few fully understood how her mind worked. While others focused on winning arguments, Hadley focused on understanding structure. Ownership to her was never just about names on a deed. It was about how those names got there, who benefited, and who was quietly erased along the way. She rarely spoke in meetings, unless she was certain. When she did, partners listened. That was how Angel Hayes first noticed her. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon during a consultation that was not supposed to be memorable. Angel arrived 20 minutes late, unbothered by it. He carried himself with a kind of confidence that suggested time adjusted around him, not the other way around. Tall, composed, dressed in a charcoal suit that looked tailored down to the last millimeter, he was the kind of client the firm valued. High net worth, active in real estate development. A man who moved properties the way others moved pieces on a board. He was there to discuss a dispute involving a luxury property acquisition in Malibu. The issue on the surface was straightforward, a disagreement over ownership percentages between two parties. But the documents told a more complicated story. Angel spoke first, effortlessly taking control of the room. "I don't like inefficiency," he said, leaning back slightly in his chair. "I want this resolved quickly." One of the senior attorneys nodded, already aligning with the tone. "Of course, Mr. Hayes. We'll review." The Hadley spoke before the sentence could finish. "Your transfer documents from April and June don't match." The room shifted almost imperceptibly. Angel's gaze moved to her for the first time. She didn't rush. She turned a page in the file, her fingers steady. In April, the property is listed under Hayes Development Group. In June, the ownership is partially reassigned to a holding entity that isn't disclosed in your initial filing. She looked up, meeting his eyes directly. There's a gap. Silence followed, not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind that demanded acknowledgement. Angel didn't respond immediately. He studied her instead. Most people, when challenged in that setting, softened their tone. They added qualifiers. They gave the other person space to maintain control. Hadley did none of that. She wasn't confrontational. She was exact. "That entity is internal," Angel said finally, his voice calm. "It may be," Hadley replied, "but it's not reflected consistently across your filings. That inconsistency is what the opposing party is using." Another pause. One of the attorneys cleared his throat, attempting to smooth the moment. "We can certainly review that in more detail." Angel raised a hand, slightly stopping him. He was still looking at Hadley. "What's your name?" he asked. "Hadley Whitmore." There was no hesitation in her answer. No attempt to soften it. He nodded once, as if committing it to memory. The meeting continued, but something had shifted beneath the surface. The attorneys returned to their structured explanations, outlining timelines and potential strategies. Angel listened, occasionally interjecting, but his attention drifted back to Hadley more than once. Not because she spoke often, but because when she did, it mattered. After the meeting ended, most clients would have left with a handshake and a polite assurance of follow-up. Angel did neither. He waited. Hadley gathered her documents methodically, aligning each page before placing it into her folder. She was used to being observed, though she rarely acknowledged it outwardly. "You're thorough," Angel said. It wasn't a compliment in the traditional sense. It was an observation. Hadley glanced at him briefly. "It's part of the job, not the way you do it." She didn't respond to that. Angel stepped closer, just enough to enter her immediate space without being intrusive. Most people look at what's presented. You look at what's missing. Hadley closed her folder. What's missing usually matters more. For a moment, neither of them spoke. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like a simple exchange client and analyst, nothing more. But there was an alignment happening, subtle and unspoken. Angel recognized something in Hadley that he didn't often encounter, someone who didn't adjust herself to the room. And Hadley, though she wouldn't have framed it that way, recognized something else. Control. Not the obvious kind, the raised voice, the overt demand, but the quieter version. The way Angel redirected conversations without appearing to. The way others deferred to him before he asked. It was familiar. Not because she admired it, but because she had seen what it did to people over time. "You handled that well," Angel said. It wasn't complicated. He smiled slightly. "Most things aren't. People make them that way." Hadley didn't return the smile. There was nothing in his tone that suggested uncertainty. Angel Hayes moved through the world with a clear understanding of his position in it. He was used to outcomes bending in his direction, used to people aligning themselves accordingly. What he wasn't used to was resistance that didn't look like resistance. Hadley didn't challenge him. She simply didn't yield. "I could use someone like you," Angel said after a moment. Hadley met his gaze again, her expression unchanged. "You already have legal counsel. I'm not talking about them." Of course he wasn't. The implication sat between them, unspoken but clear. Angel was not just referring to professional capacity. He was identifying value, and in his own way, beginning to claim proximity to it. Hadley recognized that too. But recognition did not mean reaction. "I have work," she said, a quiet boundary rather than a rejection. Angel nodded as if that answer had been expected. "So do I." He didn't press further, not yet. As he turned to leave, he paused just long enough to add, "I'll be in touch, Miss Whitmore." Hadley watched him go, not with curiosity, but with attention. There was something about the case that didn't sit cleanly. The inconsistency in the documents wasn't an oversight. It was structured, intentional. And Angel Hayes knew it. She opened her notebook once more, writing a single line beneath the date, "Hayes ownership gap, not accidental." She underlined it once. Then she closed the notebook, already aware, though she wouldn't say it aloud, that this was not a case that would remain contained within paperwork. Some patterns didn't stay on paper. They moved into people's lives. And when they did, Hadley followed them just the same. Angel Hayes did not pursue people the way most men did. There were no grand declarations, no exaggerated gestures meant to impress a room. His approach was quieter, more deliberate, built on timing observation and the careful application of attention. He did not overwhelm. He entered slowly until his presence felt inevitable. Hadley noticed that. She also noticed how intentional every interaction became after that first meeting. The first message arrived 2 days later. Brief, direct, dinner, Thursday, 7:30. Somewhere you won't hate. No emojis, no unnecessary phrasing. It wasn't framed as a question, but Neither was it forceful. It left just enough space for refusal, though it subtly assumed acceptance. Hadley read it once, then again. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she opened her notebook and wrote, "Angel Hayes communicates in controlled brevity. Assumes compliance." Only after closing the notebook did she reply. "I prefer somewhere quiet." There was no smile in the message. No invitation beyond the condition itself. His response came within minutes. "I know a place." The restaurant was exactly what she expected and exactly what he intended. Private, minimal, expensive without announcing it. A place where conversations stayed contained within the walls, and the staff knew when not to exist. Angel was already there when she arrived. Of course he was. He stood as she approached, not out of politeness alone, but because he understood optics. Every movement was measured, not stiff, not rehearsed, but practiced enough to feel effortless. "You came," he said. Hadley took her seat across from him. "You chose a quiet place." A slight smile touched his expression. "You noticed details. I noticed patterns." That answer lingered between them longer than expected. Dinner unfolded without interruption, but not without structure. Angel guided the conversation without appearing to. He asked questions about her work, her process, her preferences, but never in a way that felt invasive. Hadley answered, but selectively. She never offered more than what was asked. Angel spoke about his business with the same precision. Real estate development acquisitions, strategic partnerships. He described projects in terms of movement and control, what he could build, what he could reposition, what he could acquire. Ownership, always ownership. What he didn't do was elaborate on how those positions were secured. Hadley noticed that too. "You don't talk about your partners," she said at one point, her tone neutral. Angel didn't seem surprised by the observation. "I choose them carefully. That's not the same as not talking about them." He studied her for a second longer than before. "Some structures don't need explanation," he said. Hadley tilted her head slightly. "Or they don't survive it." The corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile, but close. "You're careful," he said. "So are you." There was no tension in the exchange, but there was clarity. Neither of them was misreading the other. The dinners continued. Not every night, not even every week, just often enough to establish rhythm. Angel introduced variation, different locations, different settings, but the underlying structure remained the same. Controlled environments, predictable outcomes, no randomness unless he allowed it. Hadley adapted without appearing to. She observed, she recorded, she remembered. The gifts came later. Never excessive at first. A book she had mentioned in passing. A pen identical to the one she used, but of higher quality. Small, precise upgrades to things she already valued. He wasn't buying her attention. He was aligning himself with it. Hadley accepted them. But each time, she made a note. Gift-giving tied to observation. Reinforces dependency subtly. It wasn't long before Angel introduced the idea of merging parts of their lives. Not abruptly, not as a demand, as a suggestion. "You spend too much time commuting," he said one evening, pouring her a glass of wine she hadn't asked for but didn't refuse. "It's manageable. It's inefficient." Hadley looked at him. There it was again. Efficiency in Angel's world was rarely about time alone. "I manage my time," she said. "I don't doubt that," he replied. "But you don't have to." The statement was simple, reasonable even. But beneath it was an offer structured like a solution. "You don't have to carry this alone." Hadley didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked, "What are you suggesting?" Angel leaned back slightly as if giving the idea space to breathe. "Stay with me. Malibu isn't far. You'd have everything you need. Everything." The word didn't go unnoticed. Hadley's gaze didn't change, but something in her attention sharpened. And in return, she asked. Angel's expression remained calm. "In return, nothing changes." That was the first moment she wrote something down before leaving the table. Later that night, in her notebook, language mismatch. Offer implies exchange. Claims no change. She underlined it twice. When Hadley eventually agreed to spend more time at the Malibu mansion, it didn't happen all at once. First weekends, then extended stays, then gradually permanence, without a formal declaration of it. Angel didn't ask her to move in. He structured circumstances so that staying elsewhere became unnecessary. Her things appeared there, piece by piece. A drawer cleared for her, then a closet section, then an entire room subtly reorganized to reflect her presence. To anyone else, it would have looked like a natural progression. To Hadley, it looked like integration. She allowed it. But she didn't stop observing. The financial conversations came next. Again, not as demands, as logic. "You shouldn't worry about expenses here," Angel said one morning, reviewing something on his tablet. "I don't," Hadley replied. "You still track them. I track everything." Angel glanced at her, amused. "That sounds exhausting." "It isn't." He set the tablet down. "We can simplify that," he said. "I can handle the shared expenses." Hadley didn't react outwardly. "What qualifies as shared?" she asked. Angel didn't hesitate. "Everything that happens here." There it was again. Scope expansion. What begins as shared quickly becomes inclusive of all. Hadley nodded slowly, as if considering. "Transparency matters," she said. "Of course. Full access." Angel smiled slightly. "You don't trust me?" Hadley met his gaze without softening. "I verify." For a brief second, barely noticeable, something in Angel's expression tightened. Not anger, recognition. He had encountered resistance before, but rarely in this form. Not loud, not emotional, just unmoved. The documents followed. Not immediately, but gradually. Angel didn't present full access. He presented curated access, selected statements, simplified summaries, enough to create the appearance of transparency, not enough to reveal structure. Hadley accepted every document he offered. And then separately, she began building her own set. Public records, archived filings, cross-referenced ownership histories. She wasn't looking for a single discrepancy anymore. She was mapping a system. And systems, when built carefully enough, always revealed their weak points. One evening, as the sun set over the Malibu coastline, Angel stood beside her on the terrace. "You're quiet tonight," he said. Hadley looked out at the horizon. "I'm thinking about..." She turned to him slightly. "Ownership." Angel's expression remained composed. "That's a broad topic." "Not really." A pause. Then softly, "People assume ownership is about control." Angel watched her. "And you don't..." Hadley's gaze returned to the ocean. "I think it's about proof." The wind moved between them, carrying the weight of the statement without needing to explain it. Angel said nothing. But he understood. And somewhere beneath the surface, though he wouldn't acknowledge it yet, he recognized the shift. Hadley Whitmore wasn't becoming part of his world. She was studying it, piece by piece, until it could no longer hide from her. The Malibu mansion did not feel like a home. It felt like a statement. Glass walls stretched toward the Pacific, reflecting a horizon that seemed endless but controlled. Every surface inside the house was intentional polished stone, softened edges, curated art that suggested taste without revealing anything personal. It was a place designed to be seen, not lived in. Hadley noticed that within the first 48 hours. There were no misplaced objects, no signs of habit, no quiet evidence of routine. Even the kitchen, fully equipped, carried no trace of use beyond what was necessary for presentation. Angel Hayes lived there, but not in the way most people lived anywhere. He occupied it. Hadley adjusted without comment. Her presence entered the space carefully, almost invisibly. A notebook placed near the edge of a table. A pair of shoes aligned beside the door. A single mug used repeatedly, always washed and returned to the same position. She did not disrupt the structure. She mapped it. The changes in Angel did not happen all at once. They unfolded gradually, the way pressure builds beneath a surface unseen, at first, then undeniable. At the firm, Angel had been controlled, composed, strategic. Inside the mansion, the control shifted. It became expectation. "You don't need to go into the office every day," he said one morning, standing near the window as Hadley prepared to leave. "I have work," she replied, fastening the clasp of her watch. "So do I. That's not the same." Angel turned slightly, his gaze steady. "You can work from here." "I can," Hadley said, "but I don't." A pause. Not long, just enough. Angel nodded once as if accepting the answer, but he did not repeat the suggestion. He didn't need to. The invitations started to change. Before they had been framed as options, now they carried weight. "There's a dinner on Friday," Angel said later that week, reviewing something on his phone. "Investors. You should be there." Hadley looked up from her notes. Should Angel glanced at her, a faint smile appearing. "You'll enjoy it." That wasn't the question. Another pause. Subtle, controlled. "It matters," he said finally. "To you, yes." Hadley held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary. Then she nodded. "I'll attend." Agreement in Angel's world was rarely about preference. It was about alignment. The dinner unfolded exactly as Hadley expected. A long table, carefully selected guests, conversations layered with implication rather than clarity. Angel moved through the room with ease, shifting between topics, guiding interactions, without appearing to dominate them. He introduced Hadley not as a partner, but as something adjacent, present, but undefined. "This is Hadley," he said to a group near the terrace. "She has a sharp eye for detail." It was not incorrect, but it was incomplete. Hadley noticed how often introductions stopped just short of acknowledgement. No title, no role, no clear position. It wasn't an oversight. It was placement. The first time Angel interrupted her, it was subtle. A guest, Mark Reynolds, one of the investors, had asked Hadley about her work. "Legal analysis," she said. "Primarily real estate. Hadley keeps things organized." Angel added smoothly, cutting across the sentence without raising his voice. The shift was almost invisible. Mark nodded, redirecting his attention back to Angel. "Must be useful," he said. "It is," Angel replied. Hadley did not correct him. She didn't need to. She simply adjusted her attention, filing the moment away. Later that night, in her notebook, interruption reframed identity. Minimization in public setting. She paused, then added, "pattern likely to repeat." It did, more frequently than before. At first, it was conversational redirecting, summarizing, simplifying her contributions. Then it became structural. Angel began making decisions without consulting her. Not just about social events, about time, about space, about presence. "I've arranged for a driver to take you to the office," he said one morning. "I don't need one. It's already scheduled." Hadley looked at him. "I didn't ask for it. You don't have to." There it was again, the offer that removed choice. Hadley considered the statement, then calmly cancel it. Angel didn't respond immediately. For a brief moment, the room held still. Then he nodded. "All right." But something had shifted, not in his words, in his expectations. The documents began to appear shortly after, left on desks, open on screens, presented casually as if transparency required no effort. "These are the latest figures," Angel said one afternoon, sliding a folder toward her. Hadley opened it. Summarized accounts, clean formatting, no irregularities at first glance. But the details were light. "Where are the source documents?" she asked. Angel leaned against the table. "You're looking at them?" "No," Hadley said quietly. "I'm looking at summaries." A small pause. "They're sufficient. For overview," she replied, "not for verification." Angel's expression didn't harden, but it didn't soften either. "You don't trust what you're given." Hadley closed the folder. "I verify what I'm given." The distinction remained between them, unresolved. It was later, when Angel was away for a meeting in San Francisco, that Hadley found the first clear inconsistency inside the house itself. Not in a file, in a cabinet. The study was rarely used, at least not in a way that suggested ongoing work. The desk remained clean, almost untouched, but the cabinet behind it held documents that hadn't been curated for display. Hadley didn't search randomly. She followed structure, files organized by property, by entity, by date, and then a mismatch. A document referencing the Malibu mansion dated 2 years prior. Ownership listed under a holding entity Hadley had not seen before. Whitmore Holdings Trust. Her attention didn't shift outwardly, but internally, something aligned. She pulled the document carefully, comparing it with the versions Angel had provided. The names didn't match, the transfer sequence didn't match, and more importantly, the trust name did. Whitmore. Her name. Hadley stood still for a moment, not out of shock, but out of recognition. Patterns once confirmed didn't surprise her. They clarified. She returned the document exactly where she found it, closed the cabinet, then sat at the desk, opening her notebook. Whitmore Holdings Trust appears in original filing, not disclosed in current summaries. She paused, then added, connection not coincidental. That evening, when Angel returned, nothing in Hadley's behavior changed. She asked about his trip. He answered. They had dinner. The conversation remained measured, controlled. But beneath it, the structure had shifted again. Not visibly, but definitively. Later, standing once more on the terrace overlooking the ocean, Angel spoke without looking at her. You've been quieter than usual. Hadley leaned lightly against the railing. I've been observing. Angel glanced at her. You always are. Yes. A pause. Then softly, but now I know what I'm looking at. Angel didn't respond. Not immediately. The waves below continued their steady rhythm, indifferent to the tension above. What do you think you see? He asked finally. Hadley turned her gaze toward him. Not what you've shown me. The words were calm, not accusatory, not emotional, just precise. Angel held her gaze. For a moment, something unspoken passed between them. Not confrontation, not yet, but awareness. Hadley Whitmore was no longer adjusting to the structure of the house. She had begun to understand it. And once understanding took hold, control became something else entirely. Hadley Whitmore did not rush conclusions. She built them, carefully, quietly, layer by layer, until what remained was not suspicion, but structure. The document she had seen in the study did not leave her thoughts, but neither did it dominate them. She treated it the way she treated everything else, as one piece in a larger system. Not proof on its own. Not yet. Patterns required confirmation. The next morning, she returned to her routine without deviation. Coffee at the same hour. Notes reviewed in the same order. Messages answered with the same measured tone. Angel noticed nothing unusual. That was intentional. At Carter and Wren, the air carried its usual rhythm-low conversations, the muted sound of printers, the quiet urgency of deadlines that never quite announced themselves, but were always present. Hadley moved through it with familiarity. Her desk remained unchanged from the day before. Files aligned, screens organized, her black notebook placed just to the right of her keyboard. She opened it and reviewed the last entry she had written the night before. Whitmore Holdings Trust appears in original filing. Not disclosed in current summaries. Connection not coincidental. She did not underline it again. She didn't need to. Instead, she opened her system and began where she always did, when something didn't align public records. Ownership in the United States leaves a trail. It can be obscured, layered, delayed, but rarely erased. Hadley accessed county property records for Malibu, narrowing her search to the parcel associated with the mansion. The current deed filed under Angel's known entity was clean, recent, structured to appear final. But she wasn't looking for what was current. She was looking for what came before. Chain of title, transaction history, entity transitions. It took less than 10 minutes to locate the previous filing. Whitmore Holdings Trust. There it was again. Filed 3 years prior. Grantor Whitmore Holdings Trust. Grantee Hayes Development Group. Hadley leaned back slightly, her eyes steady on the screen. The transfer looked legitimate at first glance. Proper formatting. Valid signatures. Recorded in sequence. But something about it was incomplete. She opened the scanned document, reviewed the signature lines, and paused. The trustee's name was listed as Eleanor Whitmore. Hadley did not react outwardly, but internally another piece aligned. Eleanor Whitmore. The name was not unfamiliar. It wasn't distant. It was personal. Hadley closed the document and reached for her notebook. Eleanor Whitmore, trustee of Whitmore Holdings Trust, same surname, likely familial link. She paused, then added, transfer to Hayes Development Group requires verification of authority. She underlined the last word, authority, because in trust law, ownership was rarely about possession. It was about permission. The next step required more than public access. It required context. Hadley opened her internal system at Carter and Wren, navigating through archived cases, older estate matters, trust disputes, anything connected to the Whitmore name. There were several entries, most irrelevant. One was not. Estate of Eleanor Whitmore. Closed 2 years ago. Handled partially by an external estate attorney, Daniel Brooks. Hadley's attention sharpened slightly. Daniel Brooks was known in the firm, not personally close to her, but respected. He specialized in complex estate structures, particularly those involving multi-generational trusts. If anyone understood Whitmore Holdings Trust, it would be him. Hadley did not contact him immediately. She gathered first. The estate file revealed limited detail summaries, not full documents, but enough to establish timeline. Eleanor Whitmore had passed away 3 years ago, shortly before the property transfer. Hadley noted the sequence. Trustee passes, property transfers. New entity assumes control. On paper, it could be clean. But Hadley had already seen enough to know paper rarely told the whole story. That evening, back at the Malibu mansion, nothing in Hadley's behavior changed. Angel was in the living area, reviewing something on his tablet. "You're late," he said without looking up. "Work," Hadley replied. Angel nodded slightly. "Anything interesting?" Hadley placed her bag down, her movements unhurried. "Yes." He glanced at her then, but she didn't elaborate. Not yet. Dinner was quiet, not uncomfortable, just measured. Angel spoke about a potential acquisition, another property, another deal structured through layered entities. Hadley listened. She always listened. But now she filtered everything differently. Every mention of ownership, every reference to control, every omission. She noted them all. Later that night, while Angel took a call in another room, Hadley sat at the dining table with her laptop open. She began building her own file. Not official, not shared, structured the way she preferred timeline. Entities, individuals, transactions. She mapped the Malibu mansion first. Whitmore Holdings Trust, Hayes Development Group, current holding structure. Then she added Eleanor Whitmore, then Angel Hayes, then a space between them, unlabeled, unexplained. For now, when Angel returned, he paused briefly behind her. "What are you working on?" he asked. Hadley didn't close the screen. Property history. Angel's gaze moved over the display, not long enough to read everything, but long enough to recognize the structure. "You don't stop, do you?" Hadley's tone remained even. "I don't like gaps." Angel stepped closer. "There are always gaps." "Yes," she said, "but some are intentional." A pause, the kind that didn't need to be filled. Angel's voice lowered slightly. Be careful what you assume. Hadley turned her head just enough to meet his eyes. I don't assume. Another pause. I verify. The next morning, Hadley made the call. Daniel Brooks answered on the second ring. Brooks. Daniel, this is Hadley Whitmore. Carter and Wren. A brief silence. Then recognition. Whitmore, he repeated. I was wondering when I'd hear that name again. Hadley's expression didn't change. I need to ask about the Whitmore Holdings Trust. Another pause, longer this time. That's not a casual question, Daniel said. I'm not asking casually. He exhaled slowly. What do you want to know who the beneficiary is? Silence. Then you don't know. Hadley didn't respond. She didn't need to. Daniel understood. I can't discuss full details over the phone, he said carefully. But I can tell you this, Eleanor Whitmore structured that trust very specifically. In what way? It wasn't designed to be transferred easily. Hadley's grip on the phone tightened just slightly. And yet it was. Yes, Daniel said. Which is why your question matters. Another pause. Then more directly, Hadley. What exactly is your connection to this? Hadley's gaze remained steady. I'm confirming it. After the call ended, she didn't move immediately. The room around her remained quiet, unchanged. But the structure she had been building it was no longer theoretical. It was personal. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the glass walls of the mansion, Hadley stood alone in the study. She opened the cabinet again, looked at the document she had seen before. Whitmore Holdings Trust. Eleanor Whitmore. The transfer. She didn't touch it this time. She didn't need to. She had already begun to understand what Angel Hayes had not said, what he had not shown, and more importantly, what he had assumed she would never look for. In her notebook that night, she wrote one final line. Beneficiary status likely suppressed. Legal position stronger than presented. She closed the notebook, set it beside her. And for the first time since entering the Malibu mansion, Hadley Whitmore was no longer just observing the structure. She was inside it. And she knew exactly where to look next. Angel Hayes preferred rooms where he controlled the tone. The Malibu mansion was one of them. But it wasn't the only one. Over the next few weeks, the gatherings became more frequent. Smaller dinners, private meetings, curated evenings, where influence moved quietly between glasses of wine and carefully chosen words. These were not social events in the traditional sense. They were extensions of business structured to look effortless. Hadley attended most of them, not because she wanted to, but because she understood the value of proximity. The first gathering after her conversation with Daniel Brooks was deliberately intimate. 6 guests, no more. Angel had selected them carefully, Victor Lane among them, along with Chloe Bennett and 2 investors Hadley recognized from previous filings, Andrew Cole and Melissa Grant. The seating arrangement was intentional. Angel at the head, Hadley to his right, close enough to be seen, not central enough to speak. You've been spending more time here, Chloe said lightly, her tone carrying the kind of warmth that rarely meant kindness. Hadley met her gaze without reacting. Yes. Chloe smiled, tilting her glass slightly. Must be nice, not having to worry about anything. The implication didn't need to be explained. Hadley didn't correct her. She didn't defend herself. She simply let the statement exist. Across the table, Victor Lane watched quietly. He had met Hadley before briefly in passing, but this was the first time he observed her in this setting. His attention lingered a second longer than necessary, as if trying to place something he couldn't quite define. Angel noticed. He always noticed. Hadley works. Angel said, his tone smooth. She just chooses where to focus her time. The statement sounded like support, but it reframed the narrative. Choice in this context became privilege, not necessity. Hadley turned her attention to her plate. Another entry filed silently. Later, as the conversation shifted toward investment structures, Andrew Cole asked a question that should have belonged to Hadley. "How do you usually handle layered ownership across multiple entities?" he asked, glancing briefly in her direction before looking back at Angel. Hadley understood the question immediately. Angel answered before she could speak. "Efficiently," he said, a faint smile forming. "That's the only way it works." Andrew nodded, satisfied enough not to press further. Hadley said nothing, but her silence was not passive. It was deliberate. That night, after the guests had left and the house returned to its curated stillness, Hadley sat alone in the living room. Her notebook rested open on her lap. Public minimization increasing, third-party perception being shaped. She paused, then added Victor Lane observing. Potential awareness. She closed the notebook slowly. Across the room, the reflection of the ocean moved against the glass. Unchanged. But everything else was shifting. The recordings began the following week, not because Hadley expected immediate use, but because patterns once established needed preservation. Angel did not raise his voice often. He didn't need to. Control in his world rarely required volume. It required consistency. "You don't need to be involved in this," he said one afternoon, reviewing documents at the dining table. Hadley stood nearby, her posture relaxed. "It's a property matter," she replied. "That's what I do." Angel didn't look up. "It's already handled." "By who, Victor?" Hadley's gaze shifted slightly. "And you trust his assessment?" Angel set the document down, finally meeting her eyes. "Yes." A pause. Then calmly, "Do you?" Hadley didn't answer immediately. She stepped closer just enough to look at the file he had been reviewing. It was a summary, not the original. "I trust what I can verify," she said. Angel's expression remained composed. "You don't have access to everything." Hadley nodded once. "I'm aware." The statement lingered longer than either of them acknowledged. Because it was true, and because it wasn't. Later that evening, Hadley reviewed the audio file. Clear, undistorted. Angel's voice steady, controlled, the phrasing precise. She labeled the file, "Access Limitation Acknowledgement," then archived it. Archived. The next incident came sooner than expected. Another gathering. Larger this time. More voices, more movement, more opportunity for observation. Hadley moved through the room quietly, her presence consistent but unobtrusive. She listened. That was always where the truth surfaced, near the edge of the terrace. She overheard part of a conversation between Victor Lane and Melissa Grant. "Transfer wasn't clean," Melissa was saying, her voice lowered. "There are still questions." Victor's response was measured. "There are always questions." That's not reassuring. It's not meant to be. Hadley didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. The information settled where it belonged. When she returned inside, Angel was speaking with Andrew Cole. He glanced at her briefly, then continued his conversation without pause. Another small detail, another placement. Hadley stood nearby listening as Andrew asked about the Malibu property. "You've held it for a while now," Andrew said. Planning to restructure, Angel smiled faintly. "It's already structured." Andrew nodded. Clean Angel's response came without hesitation. Completely. Hadley didn't react, but she didn't look away either. Later, when the guests began to leave, Chloe approached her again. "You're very quiet," she said. Hadley met her gaze. "I listen." Chloe laughed softly. "That's one way to stay comfortable." Hadley tilted her head slightly. "Comfort isn't the goal." Chloe's smile didn't fade, but something behind it shifted. That night, after the house emptied once more, Angel found Hadley in the study. The same study, the same cabinet behind her. "You spend a lot of time in here," he said. Hadley didn't turn immediately. It's quiet. Angel stepped closer. You're looking for something. It wasn't a question. Hadley finally faced him. Yes. A pause. Angel's gaze sharpened slightly, and Hadley held his eyes. I haven't decided yet. Another pause. Then Angel nodded slowly. Be careful, he said. The words were calm, but they carried weight. Hadley didn't respond. Because she understood. Later alone, she opened her notebook again. External confirmation of irregular transfer. Victor aware. Angel denies. She paused, then added one final line. Control maintained through narrative, not documentation. The pattern was complete. Not fully exposed, not yet, but defined. Angel Hayes controlled perception. He shaped what others believed, what they saw, what they accepted. But documentation followed different rules. And Hadley Whitmore had already begun to collect it, piece by piece, quietly, without interruption, without announcement, until the structure that held everything in place could no longer support itself. By the time Hadley Whitmore stopped asking whether something was wrong, she had already begun identifying exactly how it was wrong. Not emotionally, not instinctively, structurally. The difference mattered, because instinct could be dismissed. Structure could not. The Whitmore Holdings Trust was no longer a curiosity. It had become the central axis around which everything else aligned. Every conversation, every omission, every carefully managed interaction inside the Malibu mansion pointed back to one quiet fact. Angel Hayes was operating within a system he had not fully disclosed. And more importantly, one he did not expect Hadley to understand. That assumption was where the imbalance began to shift. She did not confront him. She did not question him directly. Instead, she expanded her field of verification. The next step was not inside the house. It was inside the trust itself. Hadley returned to Carter and Wren earlier than usual that morning. The office was still settling into its rhythm, most of the staff arriving in quiet waves, coffee-in-hand conversations, low and unfinished. She sat at her desk and opened a new file. Whitmore Trust Analysis. No labels beyond that, no explanation, just structure. She began by mapping what she already knew. Eleanor Whitmore had been the trustee. The trust had held the Malibu property. The property had been transferred to Hayes Development Group shortly before or after Eleanor's death. The beneficiary had not been disclosed in any of the documents Angel had provided. That absence was no longer a gap. It was a signal. Hadley accessed additional estate records this time, expanding beyond the firm's internal system. Probate filings archived notices any document that might reference the distribution of assets after Eleanor Whitmore's death. It took time, more than she usually needed, because whoever had structured the trust had done so carefully, not illegally, but strategically. The probate record itself was minimal. A summary of assets, a confirmation of closure, no detailed breakdown of beneficiary distributions. That was intentional. Trusts were designed to avoid visibility, but they still left traces. Hadley shifted her approach. Instead of looking for the beneficiary directly, she looked for what had not been transferred. Assets listed, but not reassigned. Properties mentioned, but not recorded in new ownership structures. And then she found it. A secondary filing, small, almost insignificant. A continuation clause referencing residual assets held under the Whitmore Holdings Trust. Pending beneficiary confirmation. Hadley read the line twice. Then a third time. Pending beneficiary confirmation. Not assigned, not transferred, not closed. The trust had not fully executed, which meant the authority to transfer the Malibu property might not have been complete. She leaned back slightly, her fingers still resting on the keyboard. This was no longer about inconsistency. This was about legitimacy. She opened her notebook and wrote carefully. Trust not fully executed. Beneficiary not formally confirmed. Transfer authority questionable. She paused, then added a second line. If beneficiary identified ownership claim may supersede current deed. She closed the notebook slowly, because now the question was no longer theoretical. It was personal. That afternoon, Hadley did something she had not done before. She searched her own name within the estate records. Hadley Whitmore. The results were limited at first. Public records did not always connect individuals across generations unless explicitly required. But trust structures often relied on lineage. And lineage, when documented properly, left its own trail. She expanded the search parameters: family records, archive notices, old filings connected to Eleanor Whitmore. And then quietly, without announcement, the connection appeared. A birth record, Hadley Whitmore, listed under a different county. Mother's name, Eleanor Whitmore. The room did not change. The noise of the office continued. Phones rang, papers moved, conversations overlapped. But for Hadley, everything narrowed. Not emotionally, not dramatically, just precisely. She did not react. She did not close the screen. She simply read the document again. And then once more. Confirming. Verifying. Because confirmation mattered more than reaction. Hadley had never built her identity around family history. She had grown up with fragments, partial explanations, a structure that never fully defined itself but never raised questions loud enough to demand answers. Eleanor Whitmore had not been a presence in her life, but she had not been entirely absent either. Now, the absence had form, and that form carried legal weight. Hadley reached for her notebook again. Eleanor Whitmore confirmed as biological mother. She stopped, then continued. Beneficiary status highly probable. She did not underline it. She did not need to. The next step was Daniel Brooks. Not for confirmation. That part was already done. For documentation. She called him again, this time without hesitation. He answered more quickly. I was expecting your call, he said. I need the trust documents, Hadley replied. A pause. You've confirmed it? Yes. Another pause. Longer. Then Daniel exhaled slowly. Then you understand what that means. Hadley's voice remained steady. It means the transfer should not have been finalized without beneficiary authorization. Yes, Daniel said. That's exactly what it means. Silence followed. Not uncertainty, recognition. When Hadley ended the call, she did not move immediately. She allowed the structure to settle. Because now everything she had observed inside the Malibu mansion had a foundation. Angel Hayes had not simply omitted information. He had operated on the assumption that the missing piece would never be identified, that the beneficiary would remain unknown, or uninvolved, or irrelevant. Hadley Whitmore was none of those things. That evening, when she returned to the mansion, the house looked exactly the same. Glass walls, controlled light, perfect stillness. Angel was in the living room, speaking on the phone. His tone was calm, measured, precise. We'll finalize it next week, he said. No delays. Hadley set her bag down quietly. She did not interrupt. She did not announce anything, because nothing needed to be announced, not yet. Later, after the call ended, Angel glanced at her. You're back early, he said. Hadley nodded. Yes. A pause. Everything all right? Hadley met his gaze. Yes. The answer was simple, accurate, and incomplete. Angel studied her for a moment, then nodded once. Good. That night, Hadley stood again near the terrace, looking out over the ocean. The same view, the same horizon, unchanged. But now the structure beneath her feet felt different, not because the house had changed, but because she understood what it stood on. Ownership was not about presence, not about control, not about who spoke the loudest in his room. It was about proof, and Hadley Whitmore now had it. Not in her hands yet, not in a form she would reveal, but in something far more powerful: certainty. In her notebook, she wrote one final entry before closing it for the night. Beneficiary confirmed. Transfer legitimacy compromised. Position established. She paused, then added a final line. Next step is timing. She closed the notebook, set it beside her, and allowed the silence of the house to settle around her once more. Because the structure was no longer hidden. And when structures were exposed, they did not collapse immediately. They waited for the moment when everything aligned. Hadley Whitmore knew that moment was coming. She just had to decide when. Hadley Whitmore did not move forward until the structure beneath her was stable. Certainty was not enough. It had to be documented, supported, and positioned correctly, not just for understanding, but for consequence. The confirmation of her connection to Eleanor Whitmore had not surprised her in the way it might have surprised someone else. There had been too many gaps in her past, too many unanswered questions that had never demanded resolution until now. Now they did. And the answers were no longer abstract. They were legal. The meeting with Daniel Brooks was arranged without delay. His office was not in a high-rise or a polished corporate building. It was a quieter space located in an older part of Los Angeles, where the architecture carried more history than display. The kind of place where documents mattered more than impressions. Hadley arrived 5 minutes early. Daniel was already waiting. He stood when she entered, his expression measured, observant. "You look like someone who's already made sense of it," he said. Hadley took the seat across from him. "I've confirmed enough." Daniel nodded once, as if that was the only answer he expected. He slid a folder across the table. "Then let's make it official." Inside the folder were the documents Hadley had been building toward. The trust agreement, amendments, execution clauses. Every piece structured in precise legal language, each page carrying weight not because of how it looked, but because of what it confirmed. Hadley didn't rush. She reviewed each section carefully, her eyes moving steadily across the text. The Whitmore Holdings Trust had been established over a decade earlier. Eleanor Whitmore, as trustee, retained control over its assets during her lifetime. But the beneficiary designation was clear, not conditional, not shared, singular, Hadley Whitmore. Daniel watched her as she read, not interrupting, not explaining. He understood that she did not need interpretation. She needed confirmation. When she reached the final page, she closed the folder slowly. "There's no ambiguity," she said. "No," Daniel replied. "There isn't." A brief silence followed. Then Hadley asked the question that had already been forming. "How was the transfer executed without beneficiary authorization?" Daniel leaned back slightly, folding his hands. "That's the part that doesn't align," he said. "On paper, it appears Eleanor authorized the transfer before her death." Hadley's gaze didn't shift. And off paper, Daniel held her eyes. "There are timing issues. Signatures that were processed under pressure. It's not clean." Hadley nodded once. That was enough. "Can it be challenged?" she asked. Daniel's answer came without hesitation. "Yes." Another pause. "Will it hold?" Daniel considered that for a moment. "With the right documentation, yes." Hadley didn't ask what that documentation was. She already knew. Bank records, transfer authorizations, communication trails, proof of intent, proof of sequence, proof of discrepancy. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "You need to understand something," he said. "If you move forward with this, it won't stay contained." Hadley met his gaze. "It already isn't." Daniel studied her for a moment longer, then nodded. "All right." He reached for another folder, thinner this time. "These are copies you can keep. The originals remain secured." Hadley accepted them, carefully, not as evidence yet, but as foundation. When she left Daniel's office, nothing about her pace changed. She walked the same way, breathed the same way, observed the same way. But internally, the structure had shifted again, not in uncertainty, in clarity. Back at Carter and Wren, Hadley did not return to her usual workflow immediately. Instead, she opened a separate system, secure, isolated, used only when documentation required independence from firm oversight. She began organizing everything: trust documents, property records, ownership chains, audio files, each piece categorized, cross-referenced, linked, not emotionally, systematically. The emails came next. Hadley had access to Angel's forwarded communications, though limited. What he chose to share had always been curated, but even curated information carried traces. She searched for Victor Lane, filtered by keywords: transfer, trust, authorization. The results were sparse, but one thread stood out. A short exchange: Victor Lane to Angel Hayes. Subject: finalization timing. The message was brief: documents processed. Recommend no further delay. Exposure increases with time. Hadley read it twice, then opened the response. Angel Hayes, understood. Proceed. No elaboration, no hesitation. Hadley leaned back slightly. That was enough. Not proof of intent on its own, but confirmation of awareness. She saved the thread, labeled it, archived it. The bank records were harder to access, but not impossible. Angel's financial structure relied on layered entities, but funds still moved through identifiable channels. Hadley traced the purchase of the Malibu mansion, from Hayes Development Group, backward, through holding accounts, through transfers, and then a deposit originating from Whitmore Holdings Trust. The amount matched, the timing aligned. The transfer sequence was incomplete, because the authorization did not reflect beneficiary approval. Hadley closed her eyes briefly, not in exhaustion, in alignment. Every piece was now connected: trust, property, communication, funds. Nothing stood alone anymore. That evening, back at the mansion, Angel was hosting another meeting. Smaller, more controlled. Victor Lane was there again. Hadley entered quietly, her presence acknowledged, but not emphasized. Angel glanced at her briefly. "You made it," he said. "Yes." Victor watched her more carefully this time, not casually, not dismissively, as if he was beginning to understand that her presence in the house was not what it appeared to be. The conversation moved around her. Deals, numbers, timelines. But Hadley wasn't listening for content anymore. She was listening for alignment, and she found it. In the way Victor avoided certain terms, in the way Angel redirected specific questions, in the way both of them never mentioned the trust, not once. After the meeting ended, Victor lingered, just long enough. He approached Hadley as Angel stepped away to take a call. "You work in real estate law," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Victor nodded slowly. "Then you understand how complex these structures can be." Hadley met his gaze. "Yes." A pause. Victor's voice lowered slightly. "Some things are better left as they are." Hadley didn't respond immediately. Then calmly, "Only if they're correct." Victor studied her. For a moment, something almost like recognition passed through his expression. Then he nodded once. "Good night, Miss Whitmore." "Good night." When Angel returned, he glanced between them briefly. "What was that about?" he asked. Hadley's tone remained even. General conversation. Angel held her gaze for a second longer than necessary, then nodded. "All right." Later that night, Hadley sat alone in the study once more. The cabinet remained closed. She didn't need to open it again. Everything she needed was already in motion. She opened her notebook, wrote one final entry. Documentation complete. Legal position supported. external awareness increasing. She paused, then added, "Next step is controlled exposure." She closed the notebook, set it aside, and allowed the silence of the mansion to settle around her. Because the truth was no longer something she was searching for. It was something she was preparing to reveal. And when she did, it would not be through argument, not through emotion, not through confrontation, but through something far more difficult to deny. Proof. Angel Hayes did not host events without purpose. Every gathering inside the Malibu mansion was structured to produce an outcome. Not always immediate, not always visible, but always intentional. Investors were aligned, partnerships, reinforced, narratives shaped. Even the smallest details served a function. The next event would be no different. But this one carried more weight than the others. "It's not just a dinner," Angel said one evening, standing near the window with his phone in hand. "It's a consolidation." Hadley sat across the room reviewing a document she'd already memorized. "Of what?" she asked. Angel glanced at her. "Position." The answer was simple. Vague enough to avoid specifics, clear enough to reveal intent. Hadley closed the document. "And what does that require?" Angel smiled faintly. "Presence." A pause. "Then more directly yours included." The guest list was not discussed in detail. It didn't need to be. Hadley recognized the names as they appeared gradually over the following days. Andrew Cole again. Melissa Grant. Several new investors tied to Angel's recent acquisitions. Victor Lane, of course, and others. People who did not attend casually. People who represented leverage. Hadley did not ask to see the full list. She built it herself, piece by piece. From emails, from brief mentions, from confirmations that passed through Angel's phone when he wasn't paying attention. By the time the invitations were finalized, she already knew who would be there. And more importantly, who needed to be. She did not change her behavior. That was the most important part. Consistency maintained the illusion of stability. Angel watched her the way he always did now, not constantly, but often enough to measure, to confirm, to ensure that nothing had shifted beyond his awareness. Hadley allowed that perception to remain intact. The preparations for the event unfolded with precision. Staff moved through the house in coordinated patterns. Lighting adjusted. Furniture repositioned. Every surface refined until the mansion returned to its intended state. A space designed for control. Hadley observed everything, not the aesthetics, the structure, where people would stand, where conversations would form, where attention would gather. She mapped it all without writing it down. She didn't need to. "You're quiet," Angel said the night before the event. Hadley looked up from her notebook. "I'm thinking. About tomorrow." "Yes." Angel stepped closer, his expression calm. "You don't need to." Hadley met his gaze. "I know." A pause. Then softly, "But I do." Angel studied her for a moment, then nodded once. "Just be present," he said. Hadley closed the notebook. "I will." The morning of the event arrived without disruption. No tension, no urgency. Everything moved as expected. That was what made it effective. Hadley dressed simply, not understated, not excessive, balanced, enough to be seen, not enough to distract. Angel noticed. "You chose well," he said. Hadley adjusted the sleeve of her jacket. "It's appropriate." Angel nodded. Yes. By late afternoon, the house was ready. The ocean beyond the glass walls reflected a muted sky, the light softened just enough to create the atmosphere Angel preferred. Controlled but not artificial. Guests began to arrive shortly after, one by one. Each greeted with the same measured warmth, each positioned within the space with quiet intention. Andrew Cole arrived early. Melissa Grant followed. Victor Lane entered without announcement, as he always did. His eyes moved through the room briefly before settling just for a second on Hadley. Recognition, not of identity, of position. Something had changed. He knew it. He just didn't know how yet. Angel moved through the room effortlessly. Handshakes, short conversations, subtle redirections. He controlled the pace without appearing to. Hadley remained near the center, but not at it. Visible, unobtrusive, listening. "You've been here longer than I expected," Melissa said quietly, stepping beside her. Hadley turned slightly. "Yes." Melissa studied her for a moment. "You adapt quickly." Hadley's expression didn't shift. "I observe first." Melissa smiled faintly. "That's not how most people survive in this room." Hadley met her gaze. "I'm not trying to survive." Melissa held her eyes for a second longer, then nodded once. "Interesting." Across the room, Angel was speaking with Andrew and Victor. The conversation was controlled, structured, but Hadley could see the edges of it. The points where clarity was avoided, where specifics were redirected, where certainty was implied but not proven. She moved closer, not abruptly, gradually, until she stood within the conversation without interrupting it. Andrew was asking about the Malibu property again. "You've held it long enough," he said. "What's the next move?" Angel's response was immediate. "Expansion." "Based on what structure? Existing one?" Andrew nodded, but not fully convinced. Clean Angel smiled slightly, completely. Hadley didn't speak, but she didn't look away either. Victor's gaze shifted briefly toward her, not questioning, measuring. Hadley met it without hesitation, then returned her attention to the conversation. The room continued to fill. Voices layered. Movement increased. But the structure remained intact. Angel at the center, control maintained, narrative consistent, until it wasn't. The shift did not happen all at once. It never did. It began with something small. A question from one of the newer investors. "Who handled the original acquisition?" Angel answered smoothly. "My team." "Which one?" A pause. Brief, controlled, internal. The answer should have been sufficient. But this time it wasn't. The investor nodded slowly, but his attention didn't settle. It moved toward Hadley, just for a second, then back. Hadley noted it, not as disruption, as signal. Later, as the evening progressed, Angel gathered the room's attention, not formally, but clearly. He didn't need to raise his voice. Presence did the work. "I appreciate everyone being here," he said. "There are opportunities ahead that require alignment." The room quieted. Not completely, but enough. Hadley stood where she had been, still observing. Angel continued. "The Malibu property is just the beginning," he said. "What comes next builds on that foundation." Foundation. The word carried more weight than he intended. Hadley recognized it immediately. He spoke for several minutes, confident, measured, every statement reinforcing control, ownership, certainty. Hadley did not interrupt. She did not move. She did not reveal anything. Because this moment was not hers, not yet, but it was approaching. As the speech ended, conversations resumed. The room loosened. Movement returned. But something had shifted beneath the surface. Not visibly, but undeniably. Questions had been asked, not fully answered. Attention had moved, not fully redirected. Angel turned toward Hadley as the room began to settle again. "You're quiet tonight," he said. Hadley met his gaze. "I'm listening." Angel studied her. "For what?" Hadley held his eyes for a moment. Then calmly, consistency. A pause. Then Angel smiled slightly. You'll find it? Hadley didn't return the smile. I already have. The words settled between them. Not confrontational, not emotional, just precise. Across the room, Victor Lane was watching again. More carefully this time, as if he had finally understood what he had been sensing all along. That Hadley Whitmore was not simply present in the mansion. She was positioned within it, and the structure Angel Hayes had built so carefully was no longer entirely his to control. Hadley Whitmore did not believe in improvisation when the outcome mattered. Everything she had gathered, every document, every recorded conversation, every verified inconsistency had been built toward a single objective, and that objective required precision in both timing and presentation. It was not enough to be right. It was not enough to possess the truth. The truth had to be introduced at the exact moment when it could no longer be dismissed, reframed, or quietly absorbed into the structure Angel Hayes had spent years constructing. The event unfolding inside the Malibu mansion was not yet that moment, but it was moving steadily toward it. Throughout the evening, Hadley maintained her position within the room without drawing attention to herself in any overt way yet. She remained consistently visible to those who were paying attention. This balance was intentional. She needed to be present enough that her eventual action would not feel abrupt, but not so central that Angel would anticipate it. The distinction was subtle, but critical. As conversations continued to circulate through the space, Hadley began to finalize the internal sequence she had already rehearsed multiple times in her mind. The documentation she had prepared was not excessive. It was not designed to overwhelm. Instead, it was structured to establish a clear and undeniable chain. First, the trust documentation confirming her position as the sole beneficiary of Whitmore Holdings Trust. Second, the original deed history showing the transfer sequence from the trust to Hayes Development Group. Third, the bank records establishing the flow of funds used to acquire the Malibu mansion directly tied to the trust's assets. Fourth, the email correspondence between Angel Hayes and Victor Lane, acknowledging the urgency of finalizing the transfer despite exposure risks. Each element alone could raise questions. Together, they removed uncertainty. Hadley had assembled both physical copies and digital backups. The physical documents were secured in a slim folder placed inside her bag, while the digital versions were stored across multiple locations, ensuring that no single point of failure could compromise them. She had not left anything to chance. Across the room, Angel continued to engage with his guests, moving from one conversation to another with the same controlled confidence he had demonstrated since the beginning. His posture remained relaxed, his tone measured, his responses carefully calibrated to maintain authority without appearing defensive. To anyone observing casually, nothing had changed. But Hadley was no longer observing casually. She noticed the slight delay before certain answers, particularly when questions touched on ownership structures or timelines. She noticed how Victor Lane remained closer to Angel than usual, intervening subtly in conversations that approached sensitive territory. She noticed how Melissa Grant asked fewer direct questions than before, choosing instead to listen more carefully. These were not disruptions. They were adjustments. And adjustments, when they occurred simultaneously across multiple individuals, indicated awareness, not full understanding, but awareness that something beneath the surface was not entirely stable. Hadley allowed that awareness to grow. She did not accelerate it, because acceleration created resistance, and resistance gave Angel the opportunity to regain control of the narrative. Instead, she waited. She observed, and she prepared. At one point during the evening, Andrew Cole approached her directly, his expression thoughtful rather than confrontational. "You've been here through most of this," he said, gesturing lightly toward the room. "Longer than I expected." Hadley turned toward him, her posture composed. "Yes." Andrew studied her for a moment before continuing. "You understand how these structures work." It was not framed as a question, but Hadley answered anyway. "I do." Another pause followed, longer this time, as Andrew seemed to consider how far to continue. Then you also understand, he said carefully, that clarity matters at this level. Hadley met his gaze without hesitation. It always does. Andrew nodded once, as if confirming something to himself rather than to her. Good, he said. That's what I prefer. He did not elaborate further, and Hadley did not press him. The exchange was brief, but it reinforced what she had already observed. The room was no longer operating solely under Angel's narrative. Independent evaluations were beginning to form. That was necessary, because when the moment came, the truth would not need to convince everyone. It would only need to confirm what they were already beginning to suspect. As the evening progressed, Angel gathered the attention of the room once more, not with a formal announcement, but with a shift in tone that naturally drew focus toward him. Conversations softened, movements slowed, and within seconds, he had the space he needed. I want to thank all of you for being here. He began, his voice steady and controlled. What we are building is not just a series of transactions. It is a structure designed for long-term positioning. Hadley listened without interruption, her attention fixed not on the content itself, but on how it was being received. The guests remained engaged, but no longer unquestioning. There was a subtle distance now, a layer of evaluation that had not been present in earlier gatherings. Angel continued speaking about expansion, about opportunity, about the strength of existing assets, and the confidence of future growth. Every statement reinforced the same central idea: stability. But stability, when repeated too often, could reveal its own weakness. Hadley recognized that. She also recognized that Angel did not. When he finished, the room responded with polite acknowledgement, but not the immediate alignment that had once followed his words. Conversations resumed, but with a different tone, quieter, more measured. Angel turned toward Hadley again, his expression composed, but his attention more focused than before. "You've been very quiet tonight," he said. Hadley met his gaze, her voice even. "I've been listening carefully." Angel studied her for a moment, as if weighing something he had not yet defined. "And what have you heard?" Hadley allowed a brief pause before answering, not to create tension, but to ensure clarity, enough to understand how everything connects. The response was not confrontational, but it was not neutral either. It introduced a layer that had not been explicitly acknowledged before. Angel's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly. "That's a broad statement," he said. "It's a precise one," Hadley replied. The space between them held for a moment longer than either of them intended. Across the room, Victor Lane's attention moved toward them again, sharper now, more focused. Hadley did not look at him. She did not look at anyone else, because the moment she had been preparing for was no longer approaching. It was arriving, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with the quiet inevitability of a structure that could no longer support its own contradictions. Hadley Whitmore had not rushed this. She had not forced it. She had allowed every piece to align on its own terms, within its own timing, until there was nothing left to adjust, only to reveal. And when she finally moved, it would not be to argue. It would be to present. Because in the end, the truth did not need volume. It needed position. And Hadley had already secured hers. The room did not recognize the moment when the balance shifted. It rarely did. Change, when it mattered, did not arrive with announcement or disruption. It entered quietly, settling into place, before anyone fully understood that something irreversible had begun. Hadley Whitmore felt it before she acted. Not as emotion, as alignment. Every piece she had gathered, every pattern she had confirmed, every inconsistency she had preserved, now existed within a structure that no longer required expansion. There was nothing left to search for, nothing left to verify. Only timing remained. And timing, unlike evidence, could not be documented. It had to be chosen. Angel Hayes stood near the center of the room, engaged in conversation with two investors who had arrived later in the evening. His posture remained controlled, his voice steady, his presence unchanged to anyone who was not looking closely. But Hadley was looking closely. She noticed how his attention divided more frequently now, how his responses shortened slightly when questions approached specifics, how Victor Lane remained within reach, intervening when necessary, but never appearing to do so. The structure was still intact, but it was under pressure. Hadley moved through the room, slowly, not toward Angel, not away from him, but within the space he occupied. She acknowledged conversations when required, responded when addressed, and otherwise remained exactly as she had been all evening. Present. Observing. Unremarkable in the way that allowed everything else to unfold around her. This was the final stage. Not preparation, positioning. It was Andrew Cole who shifted the moment forward. He approached Angel directly, his tone measured but no longer casual. "I want to revisit something," he said. "The Malibu property." Angel turned toward him, his expression calm. "Of course." Andrew glanced briefly at Victor, then back to Angel. "You've described the structure as complete," he continued. "I need to understand the original acquisition in more detail." The room did not fall silent, but it narrowed. Conversations nearby slowed attention, redirecting in subtle ways that did not require acknowledgement. Angel's response came without delay. "It's already been outlined." Andrew nodded slightly, not sufficiently. A pause, brief, controlled. Angel smiled faintly as if the request were reasonable but unnecessary. "What specifically are you looking for?" Clarity, Andrew said. The words settled into the space differently than Angel's had earlier. Not as assertion, as requirement. Hadley did not move. She did not speak. But her attention sharpened. This was not the moment she had planned. But it was the moment that allowed her to act. Angel glanced briefly toward Victor, then back to Andrew. "The acquisition was executed through Hayes Development Group," he said. "All documentation is in place." Andrew held his gaze. And prior to that, another pause, slightly longer. "The property was transferred," Angel replied. "From who?" The question remained simple. But it carried weight. Angel's expression did not change. "From a holding entity." Andrew's voice remained steady. "Which one?" The room tightened, not visibly, but undeniably. Victor stepped forward slightly, just enough to enter the conversation without interrupting it. "The details are available if required," he said. Andrew turned toward him briefly. "I'm asking now." Hadley stepped forward, not abruptly, not forcefully, but with a clarity of movement that redirected attention without demanding it. "I can answer that." The room did not fall silent, but it focused. Every conversation within range shifted toward her. Angel turned toward her fully now, his expression composed, but no longer neutral. "This isn't necessary," he said. Hadley met his gaze. "It is." Her tone was calm, unchanged. But it carried something that had not been present before. Finality. She reached into her bag and removed the folder. Not quickly, not dramatically. Each movement measured deliberate, impossible to misinterpret. Angel watched her closely now. Not with curiosity, with calculation. "What are you doing?" he asked. Hadley placed the folder on the table between them, clarifying. Victor's attention sharpened immediately. Andrew stepped closer. Melissa moved within range. The room, though still filled with movement, had shifted entirely toward this single point. Hadley opened the folder. The first document she revealed was the trust agreement. She did not hand it over immediately. She allowed it to be seen. "To answer your question," she said, her voice steady, directed toward Andrew, but heard by everyone. "The property was originally held under Whitmore Holdings Trust." The name settled into the room. Some recognized it, others did not. But all of them registered the shift. Angel's voice remained controlled. "That's not relevant." Hadley did not look at him immediately. "It is," she said. Then she turned slightly, her gaze moving across the small circle that had formed around them. because the transfer from that trust to Hayes Development Group was not fully authorized. Silence followed, not complete, but heavy enough to hold. Victor stepped forward, his tone measured. "That's a serious claim." Hadley met his gaze. "It's a documented one." She slid the trust agreement toward him. "Review the beneficiary designation." Victor hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking the document. His eyes moved across the page. Once. Then again. The shift in his expression was subtle. But it was there. Angel's posture changed slightly. Not visibly to everyone, but enough. "You're misinterpreting the structure," he said. Hadley shook her head once. "I'm not." She reached for the next document. The original deed history. Placed it beside the first. The property was transferred following Eleanor Whitmore's death. She continued. But the trust had not completed its execution. Andrew's attention did not leave the documents. "What does that mean?" he asked. Hadley answered without hesitation. "It means the beneficiary had not authorized the transfer." Angel's voice lowered. "This is not the place for this." Hadley looked at him fully now. "This is exactly the place." The room held. No one spoke. Because the structure that had defined the evening was no longer stable. It was being examined. In real time, Hadley reached for the final document she intended to reveal in that moment. The email. Printed, unedited. She placed it on top of the others, and this, she said, is the confirmation that the transfer proceeded despite that. Victor's eyes moved to it immediately. Andrew leaned closer. Melissa stepped nearer. Angel did not move. "Who is the beneficiary?" Andrew asked. The question was direct, unavoidable. Hadley did not answer immediately, not because she hesitated, but because timing still mattered. Even now, she allowed the silence to settle, to expand, to reach every corner of the room, until there was no space left for deflection. Then she spoke. "I am." The word did not echo. It did not need to. Because everything that followed it, every document, every pattern, every inconsistency, had already prepared the room to understand exactly what it meant. Angel did not respond immediately. For the first time that evening. For the first time since Hadley had known him. He did not control the moment. And Hadley Whitmore did not raise her voice. She did not repeat herself. She did not explain further. Because the structure no longer required explanation, only acknowledgement. Silence did not arrive all at once. It formed gradually, spreading outward from the table where the documents lay, moving through conversations that slowed, then stopped until the room held a different kind of stillness. It was not the quiet of comfort or agreement. It was the quiet of recalculation. Hadley Whitmore did not move. She stood where she had placed the documents, her posture steady. Her expression unchanged, her attention neither demanding nor retreating. She did not repeat what she had said. She did not expand on it. The statement remained where it belonged, supported not by tone, but by structure. Across from her, Angel Hayes remained equally still, but for different reasons. He had built his position on control of information, on the careful management of perception, on the assumption that every narrative could be shaped, if handled early enough and confidently enough. What he faced now was not a challenge to that control in the usual sense. It was something far less flexible. Documentation. Proof that did not require interpretation. Proof that had already been interpreted. He did not reach for the papers immediately. That hesitation was small, but it did not go unnoticed. Victor Lane was the first to act. He had already begun reviewing the trust document, but now he moved more decisively, lifting the additional pages Hadley had placed on the table. His attention shifted between them with increasing focus, his posture tightening slightly as the connections became clear. Andrew Cole stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the documents without attempting to conceal his interest. Melissa Grant moved within range as well, her earlier distance replaced by a directness that reflected the weight of the moment. No one spoke. Because nothing Hadley had presented invited immediate contradiction. It required evaluation. Angel finally reached for the documents. His movements remained controlled, but the precision had changed. It was no longer about appearance. It was about confirmation. He looked first at the trust agreement, then the deed history, then the email. His expression did not fracture, but it no longer carried the same certainty. "That doesn't change the current structure," he said, his voice measured. Hadley did not respond immediately. She allowed the statement to exist, to settle, to be understood for what it was. An attempt to reframe. Then she answered, "It does." Her tone remained calm, but the clarity in it removed any ambiguity. "The transfer required beneficiary authorization," she continued. "Without it, the validity of the deed is compromised." Victor looked up from the documents, his attention shifting between Hadley and Angel. "That's accurate," he said, though his voice carried more caution than agreement. Angel turned slightly toward him. "You're basing that on incomplete interpretation." Victor held his gaze. "I'm basing it on the documents in front of me." The distinction was quiet, but definitive. Hadley observed the exchange without interruption, because the structure was now doing what it was meant to do. It was no longer her responsibility to argue, only to maintain position. Andrew straightened slightly, his attention still fixed on the table. "If this holds," he said, choosing his words carefully, "then the ownership of the property is not what we've been told." No one corrected him, because no one could. Angel's response came after a brief pause. "The property is under my control," he said. Hadley met his gaze. Control and ownership are not the same. The sentence landed without force, but it carried weight that could not be redirected. Angel's jaw tightened just slightly. "You're creating a problem that doesn't exist," he said. Hadley did not raise her voice. "I'm identifying one that already does." The room did not react outwardly, but the shift was complete. The narrative that had held the evening together was no longer intact. It had been replaced by something less flexible, something that required resolution. Victor set the documents down carefully, his movements slower now, more deliberate. "This needs to be reviewed formally," he said. Hadley nodded once. "It will be." Angel looked between them, his expression controlled, but no longer unaffected. "This is not a discussion for tonight," he said. Hadley did not challenge the statement. She did not need to. She simply reached into her bag again and removed a second set of documents. Copies, organized, prepared. She placed them on the table beside the originals. "These are for review," she said. Her tone remained even, unchanged. "I've already scheduled a formal evaluation." Victor's attention sharpened. With who Hadley met his gaze? Daniel Brooks. The name settled into the room with immediate recognition. Victor did not respond right away, but the impact was clear. Daniel Brooks was not someone who engaged without cause, and he did not proceed without documentation. Angel's expression shifted again, this time more visibly. "You've already moved forward with this," he said. Hadley held his gaze. "Yes." A pause followed. Not long, but long enough. "You didn't discuss it with me," Angel said. Hadley's answer was simple. It didn't require discussion. The words were not confrontational. They were factual, and that distinction removed any space for negotiation. Melissa stepped slightly closer, her voice quieter than before. "If the trust hasn't been executed properly," she said, "then any decisions based on this property are exposed." Victor nodded once. "That's correct." Andrew exhaled slowly, his attention shifting from the documents to Angel. "This affects more than just ownership," he said. Angel did not respond, because there was no immediate response that could restore the structure. Hadley observed all of it, not with satisfaction, not with urgency, but with the same steady attention she had maintained from the beginning. Because this was not the end of the process. It was the point at which the process became visible. Angel looked back at her, his voice lower now. "You should have come to me first." Hadley's expression did not change. I did. A pause. You chose not to show me everything. The words did not accuse. They clarified. Angel held her gaze. For a moment, something unspoken passed between them. Not anger, not disbelief, recognition. The structure he had built had not been broken from the outside. It had been understood from within. An understanding could not be undone. The room remained quiet, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that needed to be said had already been presented. The documents remained on the table, unmoved, undeniable. Hadley did not gather them. She did not reclaim them. She left them where they were, because they no longer belonged to her alone. They belonged to the situation, to the structure, to the consequence that would follow. After a moment, she stepped back, not as retreat, as completion. Her role in this moment was finished. The rest would proceed without her needing to guide it. Angel did not stop her. Victor did not call her back. No one spoke, because the silence now carried something different, not uncertainty, understanding. And once understanding entered a room like that, it did not leave unchanged. Recognition did not arrive with a single reaction. It unfolded in layers. Some understood immediately. Others resisted, not because the evidence lacked clarity, but because accepting it required them to reconsider decisions already made. In a room built on confidence, hesitation was subtle, but it carried weight. Hadley Whitmore did not remain at the center of the room. After stepping back from the table, she moved slightly to the side, allowing the documents to become the focal point rather than herself. This was intentional. The moment was no longer about her statement. It was about what others would do with it. Angel Hayes remained where he was. For a man who had spent years controlling outcome, stillness was not unfamiliar, but this stillness was different. It was not strategic. It was evaluative. He was no longer guiding the conversation. He was inside it. Victor Lane was the first to speak again. His tone measured professional, stripped of the casual flexibility he had maintained earlier in the evening. "This needs immediate review," he said, looking at Angel, but addressing the room as well. "The trust documentation raises valid questions regarding the legitimacy of the transfer." The phrasing was careful, not accusatory, not defensive. But it did something important. It acknowledged the issue without aligning fully with either side. Angel turned slightly toward him. "You're reacting too quickly," he said. Victor did not look away. "I'm reacting appropriately." That distinction settled into the space with more force than anything that had been said before, because Victor Lane had not contradicted Angel directly until now. And now he had. Andrew Cole stepped closer to the table again, his attention fixed on the documents. He did not touch them, but his posture reflected a shift from interest to assessment. "If the transfer isn't valid," he said, speaking slowly, "then the property isn't secured under your current structure." Angel's response came without hesitation. "It is secured." Andrew held his gaze. "Then demonstrate that." The request was simple, direct, and impossible to satisfy immediately. Angel did not answer, not because he could not speak, but because anything he said without documentation would carry less weight than what had already been presented. Hadley observed this without expression. This was the point where control moved from assertion to verification. And verification did not respond to confidence. It responded to evidence. Melissa Grant, who had remained quiet for most of the exchange, finally spoke, her voice lower than before, but more precise. "This affects exposure across multiple agreements," she said. "If the underlying asset is contested, everything tied to it becomes unstable." Victor nodded once. "That's correct." Angel's jaw tightened again, though he maintained composure. "This is a misinterpretation," he said. Hadley did not respond. She did not need to, because the conversation had moved beyond her. Victor turned slightly toward Angel. "Then we need to clarify it formally," he said. Angel's gaze shifted briefly across the room. He was assessing, not the documents, The people. Who was still aligned? Who was beginning to distance? Who would wait? Who would act? That calculation, once automatic, now required effort. And effort in a room like this was visible. Andrew exhaled slowly. "I'm not comfortable moving forward without resolution," he said. The statement was not loud, but it was decisive. Melissa did not repeat it. She did not need to. Her silence aligned with it. Victor closed the folder, his movements deliberate. "This will require immediate legal review," he said. "No further actions should be taken until the ownership position is confirmed." Angel looked at him. "You're advising delay. I'm advising verification." The correction was subtle, but it removed any suggestion of hesitation. This was not caution. It was requirement. Hadley shifted her attention briefly toward the window. The ocean beyond the glass remained unchanged, its movement steady and different to what had unfolded inside the house. That contrast did not escape her, because the structure inside the room had changed completely. Not dramatically, but permanently. Angel finally spoke again, his voice lower, more controlled. "This is being handled." Victor did not respond. Andrew did not acknowledge it. Melissa remained still, because the statement no longer carried the authority it once had. Hadley turned back toward the table. The documents remained exactly where she had placed them. Untouched now, but not ignored. They had already done their work. Angel's attention returned to her. For the first time since the moment had shifted, his focus was not divided. It was direct. "You've made your point," he said. Hadley met his gaze. "I've presented the facts." A pause followed. Not tense, not loud, but defined. Angel held her eyes for a moment longer, then looked away. That movement, small as it was, did not go unnoticed, because it marked something that had not occurred before. He had yielded the center of the moment, not completely, not permanently, but enough. Victor stepped back slightly, creating space between himself and the table. "I'll coordinate with Daniel Brooks," he said. "We'll review the trust, the transfer, and the supporting documentation." Hadley nodded once. "That's appropriate." Angel did not object, because objection at this point would require something stronger than denial, and he did not have it available. Andrew straightened his posture, no longer engaged in discussion, but in conclusion. "I'll wait for the outcome," he said. Melissa followed. "So will I." Their positions were clear. Not rejection, but suspension. And suspension in a structure built on forward movement carried its own consequences. The room began to shift again. Not back to its original state, but away from the moment that had defined it. Conversations resumed. Quietly, cautiously. No one returned to the same tone as before, because the foundation had changed. Hadley did not remain. She did not need to. Her role had been precise, contained, complete. She moved toward the exit without drawing attention, not hurried, not delayed, just steady. Angel did not stop her. Victor did not call after her. No one did, because there was nothing left to say that would alter what had already been established. As Hadley reached the door, she paused briefly. Not to look back, not to reconsider, but to acknowledge the shift. Then she stepped outside. The air was cooler, quieter, unchanged. And for the first time since entering the Malibu mansion, Hadley Whitmore was no longer inside the structure she had been studying. She had stepped beyond it, leaving it to resolve itself. The consequences did not arrive immediately, but they did not take long either. Structures built on confidence can absorb doubt for a short time, especially when the people inside them are accustomed to risk. But when doubt is supported by documentation, when it is reinforced by independent verification, and when it touches the foundation of ownership itself, it does not remain contained. It spreads. Quietly at first, then with increasing clarity. By the following morning, the Malibu mansion no longer held the same atmosphere it had the night before. The physical space remained unchanged, every surface still aligned and every object still in its place, but the function of the space had shifted. It was no longer a setting for control. It had become a site of exposure. Angel Hayes felt that before he acknowledged it. He stood in the living room, looking out toward the ocean, his phone resting in his hand, notifications arriving in steady intervals. Messages from investors, requests for clarification, delayed responses where there had once been immediacy. He did not respond to them right away. He read them, measured them, calculated. Across the room, Victor Lane sat at the long table, the same documents from the night before, now arranged in a more formal order. Copies had been made, notes had been added, sections marked for review. The tone between them had changed, not dramatically, but definitively. "This is already moving," Victor said without looking up. Angel did not turn. "It's contained." Victor paused, then lifted his gaze. "No," he said, "it's not." The statement was not confrontational. It did not need to be, because both of them understood the implications. Angel finally turned, his expression composed, but more restrained than before. "Daniel Brooks is involved," Victor continued. "That alone changes the scope." Angel walked slowly toward the table. "He doesn't control the outcome." "No," Victor agreed. "But he controls how it's evaluated." Angel said nothing, because that distinction mattered. And he knew it. The Victor gestured toward the documents. "The trust is clear," he said. "The beneficiary designation is not ambiguous. The timing of the transfer is questionable. The authorization is incomplete." Angel's voice remained steady. It was processed. Victor met his gaze. "That doesn't make it valid." The room held still for a moment. Not tense, not loud, just defined. Angel exhaled slowly, then looked down at the documents. "What's the exposure?" he asked. Victor did not hesitate. "Significant." A pause. Worst case, Victor's answer came just as evenly. "The transfer is invalidated. Ownership reverts." Angel's jaw tightened slightly. "To her, sir?" Victor nodded once. "Yes." The name was not spoken. It did not need to be. Hadley Whitmore had already established her position. And that position now existed beyond the room, beyond the conversation, beyond Angel's control. Angel straightened. "We challenge it," he said. Victor considered that. "We can review it," he replied. "But challenging it requires grounds. There are always grounds." Victor held his gaze. "Not when the documentation is this clean." The words settled with quiet finality, because Victor was not speculating. He was assessing, and his assessment did not align with Angel's expectation. Angel turned away again, his attention returning briefly to the window. For a moment, he said nothing. Then more quietly, "What about the communications?" Victor glanced at the printed email. "They don't help." Angel's expression hardened slightly. "They don't prove intent." "No," Victor said, "but they show awareness." Another pause. And in that pause, the structure continued to shift, not collapsing, but no longer stable. Elsewhere, Hadley Whitmore did not follow the immediate aftermath. She did not return to the mansion. She did not initiate further contact. She did not need to. The process she had set in motion was already moving forward without her intervention. That morning, she sat in a conference room at Carter and Wren. Her laptop open, her notes, arranged, her posture unchanged. Across from her, Daniel Brooks reviewed the same documents Victor had been examining, though his approach was different, less reactive, more conclusive. "The trust holds," he said after several minutes of silence. "There's no ambiguity in the beneficiary designation." Hadley nodded. "I expected that." Daniel looked up at her. "The transfer will be challenged," he continued. "It won't hold under scrutiny." Hadley's expression remained steady. "How long? Not long," Daniel replied. "The documentation is aligned. Once it enters formal review, the outcome is predictable." Predictable. The word did not carry satisfaction. It carried completion. Hadley closed her notebook. "Then we proceed." Daniel studied her for a moment. "You're not asking what happens to him?" Hadley met his gaze. "No." A brief pause followed. Then Daniel nodded. "All right." The formal process began that afternoon. Notifications were sent, reviews initiated, requests filed. Each step followed established procedures structured in a way that did not require urgency to be effective, because when documentation was this clear, time did not weaken it. It confirmed it. By the second day, the responses had shifted further. Investors requested distance, agreements paused, conversations that once moved forward now waited. Angel Hayes did not lose everything at once. That was not how structures like his dissolved. They unraveled, thread by thread, connection by connection, until what remained no longer resembled what had been built. Hadley did not observe most of this directly. She did not attend follow-up meetings. She did not respond to indirect inquiries. She did not correct anyone's interpretation, because she did not need to manage perception. The documentation was doing that. Late in the afternoon, as the formal review continued, Hadley returned briefly to the Malibu property. Not to reclaim it, not to assert anything, just to close the loop. The house stood exactly as it had before. Glass, stone, silence. No visible sign of what had shifted inside it. Angel was not there. Victor was not there. The staff moved quietly, uncertain, but composed. Hadley walked through the space without pause, not examining, not searching, just passing through. Because there was nothing left to find, she stepped onto the terrace one last time. The ocean stretched out in front of her, unchanged its movement, steady and indifferent. Ownership, she had once said, was about proof. Now that proof had been established. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. Hadley did not stay long. She turned, walked back through the house, and left without announcement. Because the structure no longer required her presence. It had already been resolved, not emotionally, not personally, legally. And that was the only resolution that mattered. Resolution did not announce itself. It arrived in documents, in signatures, in confirmations that carried no emotion, no tone, no need for interpretation. By the end of the week, the formal review had concluded. The outcome aligned exactly with the structure Hadley Whitmore had already understood before she ever stepped into Daniel Brooks's office. The Whitmore Holdings Trust had not been fully executed at the time of transfer. The authorization required for the property to move into Hayes Development Group had not been validly obtained. The chain of ownership, once examined in full, did not support Angel Hayes' claim. Legally, the conclusion was simple. The Malibu property reverted, not as a dramatic reversal, not as a public spectacle, but as a correction. Ownership properly established returned to its original structure, to its beneficiary, to Hadley Whitmore. Angel Hayes did not contest the decision publicly. He did not issue statements. He did not attempt to reframe the outcome in the way he had managed perception before, because this was no longer a matter of perception. It was documented, filed, confirmed. Any attempt to challenge it would have required a foundation he no longer had. His position, once defined by certainty, had been reduced to response. Legal, measured, contained. Victor Lane remained involved, though his role had shifted from support to mitigation. He reviewed the outcome, advised on next steps, and ensured that the broader exposure did not extend beyond what could be contained within the legal process. But containment did not mean recovery. It meant limitation. The investors responded accordingly. Andrew Cole withdrew from further engagement, not abruptly, but with clarity that left no room for reconsideration. Melissa Grant paused all pending agreements, citing the need for structural reassessment. Others followed in quieter ways, reducing communication, delaying commitments, stepping back without announcement. No one made a spectacle of it. They did not need to. The shift was understood. Hadley Whitmore did not attend the final review. She did not need to. Daniel Brooks represented her position, fully presenting the documentation with the same precision she had used to assemble it. There were no surprises, no unexpected complications. The process unfolded exactly as it should have. When Daniel called her afterward, his tone was as measured as always. "It's done," he said. Hadley listened. "Yes." A brief pause. "You're now the confirmed owner." The statement carried no emphasis. It did not require it. Hadley closed her notebook. "Thank you." Daniel waited for a moment, then added, "If you intend to retain the property, we can discuss." "I won't," Hadley said. Another pause. "All right," Daniel replied. "Then we'll proceed accordingly." There were no further questions, because Hadley had already made her decision. She returned to the Malibu mansion one final time, not to reclaim it, not to occupy it, but to conclude her presence within it. The house stood as it always had, unchanged in appearance, unchanged in structure, but no longer aligned with the narrative it once supported. Hadley entered without hesitation. The staff acknowledged her quietly, their tone respectful but uncertain. They had already been informed of the outcome, though not in detail. They understood enough to adjust their behavior, but not enough to fully interpret it. Hadley moved through the space with the same steady pace she had maintained from the beginning. The living room, the dining area, the study. Each room carried the same controlled stillness, but without the underlying tension that had once defined it. The cabinet in the study remained closed. She did not open it. There was nothing left inside that she needed. On the terrace, the ocean remained unchanged. The horizon stretched outward, indifferent to ownership, unaffected by documentation, untouched by the structures people built to define control. Hadley stood there for a moment, not reflecting, not reconsidering, simply observing. Because observation for her had never been about emotion. It had been about understanding. And now there was nothing left to understand. Inside a single folder rested on the table. Prepared, finalized. Documents confirming the reversion of ownership. Transfer instructions for the next phase. Sale authorization. Hadley reviewed them once, then signed. Not quickly, not slowly, just precisely. Because completion did not require ceremony, Angel Hayes did not return while she was there. There was no confrontation, no final exchange, no attempt to reclaim what had already been resolved. Their interaction had ended where it needed to. At the point where truth replaced assumption, where structure replaced narrative. When Hadley left the mansion, she did not look back. Not because she was avoiding anything, but because there was nothing left to observe. The structure she had entered had been understood, examined, and resolved. It no longer held her attention. Days later, the property was placed on the market. Not publicly at first, quietly, through channels that matched its value. Interest formed quickly, offers followed. The transaction proceeded without complication, because now the ownership was clear, and clarity, once established, moved efficiently. Hadley returned to her work at Carter and Wren without interruption. Her desk remained as it had been. Her notebooks continued to fill. Her routines remained unchanged. Colleagues asked few questions. Those who understood the situation did not need to ask. Those who did not understand did not require explanation. Hadley did not provide one, because the outcome did not need to be discussed. It had already been established. Angel Hayes' name did not disappear. But it changed. It appeared less frequently, with less certainty, attached to fewer commitments. The structure he had built did not collapse entirely, but it no longer expanded. And in his world, that distinction mattered. Hadley did not follow that either. She did not monitor his position. She did not track his recovery, because her role had never been to oppose him. It had been to understand what was true and act accordingly. On an ordinary afternoon weeks later, Hadley sat at her desk reviewing a new case file. Different property, different structure, different names, but the same principles: ownership, verification, proof. She wrote a single line in her notebook. Structure determines outcome. Then she closed it and continued. Because the work had never been about a single case. It had always been about the system beneath it. And that system, once understood, did not change. Hadley Whitmore did not leave with victory. She left with clarity, and she carried it forward. Without noise, without display, without the need to prove it to anyone else, because the proof had already been established, exactly where it mattered. The story does not end with the moment the truth is revealed. It continues in the quiet decisions that follow, in the spaces where no one is watching, where outcomes are no longer uncertain but still carry weight. Hadley Whitmore did not raise her voice to be heard. She did not force the moment to arrive. She allowed it to form piece by piece until it could stand on its own without her needing to defend it. That is a different kind of strength, one that does not seek recognition but leaves a lasting effect wherever it is applied. What she walked away with was not the house or the money or the outcome others might focus on. It was something less visible and far more enduring. It was the certainty that comes from knowing when to act and when not to. The understanding that truth, when properly supported, does not need urgency. It only needs the right moment. And perhaps that is what stays with us the longest. Not the confrontation, not the exposure, but the quiet discipline of someone who sees clearly, waits patiently, and moves only when the outcome is no longer in question. If you found something meaningful in this story, you can take a moment to reflect on where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. It is always interesting to see how far a story like this can travel. And if stories about quiet strength, accountability, and truth told without noise resonate with you, you may choose to stay connected. There will always be more to observe, more to understand, and more stories waiting to be told.